You can, you'll hear me in a second. All right, now it's time to get started. All right, so we've been looking into Daniel, and a chapter, probably of all the chapters of the book of Daniel, probably the most familiar story that is told in this, where we see in Daniel chapter 3, the story of the fiery furnace. And so I want to look at this in a way that we can still get some information out of it that, fits into this overall theme that we've been looking at. There's so much good indication throughout the book of Daniel of how God is at work. And we talked about this for those who haven't been here for the other, the lessons, about if you take even all the stuff leading up to how they ended up in captivity in Babylon is one thing that you can see God at work, because he needed his people to learn some lessons, but at the same time still be preserved as a people. And being carted off with the kind of the higher up, the upper echelon of their society, being carted off to Babylon, helped to accomplish this. It did still leave some of the people back in their land. They were able to return later. And through the returning later, they were able to gain certain amounts of status within the Babylonian times, which sets them up for being in that same status when the Medes and the Persians come in, which allows them permission to go back and rebuild. And that's a really critical thing to understand and not miss as we're looking through this, is that a lot of what we're seeing happening is God working it out so that his people can make the return to Israel and be able to accomplish more of what he has out ahead of them. So this is where we're looking at this week, where we're going to be looking at Daniel chapter 3 in particular, the fiery furnace. So Nebuchadnezzar's religious life, if you really look at it, it's a bit of I say confusing, it's a bit of a conundrum, really. He goes back and forth in so many ways between this absolute feverish desire to worship other gods to then, if anybody says anything against this God, this God of Israel, then I'll kill you. And then he goes back and he worships other things that he makes, and it goes back and forth and back and forth. And so there's a lot of very strange things about it. But one thing we can say is that whatever his God du jour is, his commitment's there. I mean, he is committed for a few minutes, but he's committed when he wants it. He is 100% all on for that few minutes of that day. So he has this really polarizing type of a personality where he goes from extremely connected to what he's wanting to do, then the pendulum swings and he's extremely on fire for this. So he has that in his personality, and you'll see that kind of coming out through a lot of these stories when we look at this. And a lot of that's really tied into his ego. His ego is what so much drives him, and you can see that play itself out in many ways when, the thing that we looked at in Daniel chapter 2, when he dreamt of this statue, the biggest thing that he was probably most bothered by is he could tell if he was the head, then he probably matched up with the face pretty well, something, because he knew there was something about that he knew enough to be kind of concerned by it. That's why he wouldn't tell anybody his dream and made them interpret it for him and tell him what it was. So when he knew that something bad might come of it, and I think that bothered him to the point where he was willing to put anybody else to death over it, because his ego was that there's nobody's going to take me kind of down. And you see that in that one. We're going to see that again in this chapter as well. So King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold 60 cubits high, 6 cubits wide, and set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then he summoned the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. Now, one thing to understand, as kind of even talked about when Jim mentioned earlier when we were in the communion talk in the first service, is that it's not like you can just go to a lumber yard and pick up supplies or whatever. This is a big statue. I mean, this took a lot of effort to put this forward. This isn't just one day he just decided, I'm going to build a statue, that's a rather large one. So when we look at this, a 60 cubits is 90 feet tall. So it's a 90-foot tall statue. That's a large statue by modern standards, let alone by ancient world kind of standards. This thing is enormous. 6 cubits is 9 feet wide. Now, we could assume that maybe thinner or wider than it is thin, just because it's we don't know exactly what this image is, but we assume it's kind of an image that they're all going to bow down and worship. Let's just say it's cylindrical for the sake of what I'm about to do. We're about to do math. Oh no. So if it's cylindrical, then Who remembers the formula for the volume of a cylinder? That's right, pi r squared times the height. I knew somebody would know. By the way, nobody said that out. So you take pi times the radius, which is 4.5 feet, square that, multiply it by the height of 90, and you come up with 5,725.5 square feet of whatever material. In this case, it's gold. And that's just a ridiculous amount of gold when you look at it. And so when you take a square foot of gold, that weighs 1,206 pounds. So how much this thing weighs in and of itself is 6.9 million pounds. This is in and of itself a feat that they were able to get this thing upright, and just hard to even wrap your mind around the size of this thing. And if you were to take the current value of gold trading on the market per pound at about $28,432, in modern day, this thing is worth $196 billion. This isn't one little, I think I'm going to put something up here. This was a project. This was an undertaking that he did. So to understand, before we even get to the fiery furnace, this was a big deal that was going on at this time. When he set up this image and had everybody worship it, he had put all of himself and his people into it. He had devoted resources after resources. He had, I don't know how much mining had to have gone on. It's interesting, gold is in a little bits in here across everybody in the whole world. He's got a little bit of gold here and there, not everybody, but every country there's this amount of gold. There's storage of it here. It's been mined over the years. I don't know at what point in time they were able to amass this much of it, but this probably predates when most individuals had access to gold. And so he's got the access to it. He pulls in from all of his different locations this enormous amount of gold, whether it was solid gold or not, maybe it was overlaid, we don't know. Regardless of that, we see in some way, shape, or form, whether this is an underestimate because maybe it wasn't cylindrical, maybe it was more, kind of a column that's squared off, then it would be even a larger number. Maybe it was skinnier, it's a larger number, or smaller number. You get the idea. It's huge. Regardless of how you look at it, this thing was extremely valuable. It was extremely heavy, and it was a big, big statue. So when he says he wants everyone to bow down, the herald loudly proclaimed, nations and peoples of every language. This, again, the entirety of the kingdom is being told this. This is what you're commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And then there's a penalty if you don't, and that is where I've got Josh. He's going to read to us the penalty in verse 6.
Whoever is gone, honor, and worship Cornelius and from the birds of burden. Back to you.
All right, Josh, thanks. So again, if you don't bow down right now, when you hear all that musical instrument kicked in, if you don't bow down and worship, you're done. You're going to be thrown immediately into a burning furnace. There is no, there's no trial. There's no, course of action that goes on. So this is what the penalty was immediately on there. Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, and all kinds of music, all the nations and people of every language fell down and worshiped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. The interesting thing when you look at this is, think about what kind of a mind control Nebuchadnezzar had over his people, that he could just randomly set up an image of whatever. It's an image of gold. We could assume it's an image of him, but that's an assumption. And it's just an image of gold, of something. We don't know what it was. He sets it up. It's huge. It's this massive gold thing that's probably glaring in the Babylonian sunlight, and and all this. It's out in this plain of Dura. It's out there, and everyone is supposed to just bow down and worship it. It's such an interesting thing when you think about how much control Nebuchadnezzar had. None of these people had any belief that there was something special about this. This is just what they were told they had to do. And out of compulsion, they bow down and worship this. I don't know what they thought was going to come out of worshiping this. I don't know what promises they thought were held in there. We're not told any of those kinds of, if there was a rationale behind it that was thrown out to them. All we know is that they were told to do this. The music kicks in. and the sheep bow down. That's all that we see. Is they just follow orders because King Nebuchadnezzar had that much authority and power over them. At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "May the king live forever. Your majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into the blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon," which therein is the issue. Jealousy rears its ugly head right there. And you see, it's like, well, you put these guys in charge, and apparently they're not the greatest guys because they won't do what you're supposed to be doing. And so clearly they're not too happy about it. Interestingly, the astrologers, I find it odd. Is there anything odd about the astrologers being the ones to bring this forward? I mean, there's a lot of odd things about astrologers, I think, on that part. But as far as like why on this case, that they would be the group that would come forward and throw this accusation out? Any thought of like why this is? There's something really odd if you look back to chapters 1 and 2. Why would this group be the most unexpected one? Yeah.
Well, you figure these are the same group of people that Nebuchadnezzar challenged to answer the dream.
Yeah.
Explain the dream without telling what the dream was about.
So why are they alive right now then?
They know he did it.
Yeah.
They knew Daniel could do it.
Well, these are Daniel's friends. To be fair, this wasn't Daniel. So I don't know. Let's assume they knew that connection, that it was because of Daniel that they got there. So, but shouldn't they at least realize that if it weren't for what happened in the last chapter, which again was them, I don't know how much time had elapsed, but they would know that the only reason I'm currently alive is because these Jews stepped in and interpreted that dream that had me sentenced to being cut up into pieces. Yeah, well, jealousy will erase short-term memory is what we kind of see happening there, because what you have happen is you've got these guys who are only alive because of these Jews and God's delivering of the message through them from last chapter. And now, as soon as something goes that they think that the jealousy kicks in, that they've been put into a position of authority, and as soon as they get the gotcha kind of thing, they're going to go right after them. Despite the fact that they're only alive because of them, as soon as they find some fault in them, they're going to try to take them down. So there are some Jews, verse 12. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you've set up. Furious with rage, because pendulum swings the other direction, it went from completely, exuberantly happy that his image had been set up and everyone should bow down, to the other side, furious with rage. And now you see the other side of Nebuchadnezzar's personality is very short-tempered. He summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold that I have set up?" And it's interesting because I'm going to just read this. I don't have it up on the screen. I'm going to read you the end of chapter 2 so you can see the pendulum swing. At the end of after this dream was interpreted, then King Nebuchadnezzar fell prostrate before Daniel and paid him honor and ordered that an offering and incense be presented to him. The king said to Daniel, "Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery." Then the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon, placed him in charge of all its wise men. Moreover, at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego administrators over the province of Babylon, while Daniel himself remained at the royal court. Even Nebuchadnezzar forgot that he had once made this proclamation that the God they served was greater than any of the other gods. So then for him to get so mad that his gods aren't being served by him or by them, was more of an ego issue than it was anything else, because it was a direct opposition to his decree. And that's really what set him off there. He says in verse Verse 15, now when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? Oh, I don't know. Maybe the one that told you what your dream was about and interpreted it. I mean, it's interesting how Nebuchadnezzar, again, also suffers from the same short-term memory issue that he just can't quite remember it. This interesting thing, too, that we're going to see throughout each chapter until Nebuchadnezzar's demise is that when he makes a mistake, so often it's a mistake that he knew better than to go down this route. He continually makes these mistakes because something gets in the way of him understanding how much greater God is than him and how he should understand at this point that God has been crafting things in such a way that put Nebuchadnezzar in the control that he's in. Nebuchadnezzar's self-worth, though, becomes the focus. It's all about him and his, that how much he brings to the table. This idea that he says, what God can serve you from this. But again, in the subsequent chapters, we're going to see this again when he goes crazy after he was told, don't get so haughty about all these buildings you see there. And he goes up on the rooftop and just says, look at all these great buildings I've made. It's like you see it like the demise just right before him all the time and things that he's been warned of. But he doesn't care, I don't think, as much about the worship of the statue as much as that he was being ignored. And I think that's what really bothers him. He brings them in there and he gives them another chance to obey him. And the reason why I say that I think that's what comes out of that is because the last line he says is, what God will be able to rescue you from my hand. And it all becomes about him again. And I think he's pitting himself against the power of God at the beginning of this story. So when we see it play itself out, it's not really a surprise of how God comes to the rescue. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you on this matter. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, then the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you've set up. This high level of devotion from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is kind of very much in contrast to what we see out of the rest of the people around there is, okay, you want me to serve this? I'll bow down to this one. What, we're doing this one today? Okay, well, that's how the people are kind of just being led by Nebuchadnezzar. The religious existence of Babylon at this time as honestly at the very, very best psychotic. I mean, it's constantly, it's just zipping around. It's like it's short-circuiting. And, okay, we're worshiping this one. I've set up this image of gold. Let's worship this one. Okay, music kicks in. It's unfathomable that everybody was just going along with this. But when you have a power of that is as great as Nebuchadnezzar, there was no really going against it. And then you get Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who realize we know a greater power than your power here on earth. And ultimately, if he doesn't save us, so be it. We're still not going to bow down. We're not going to go against God just because you want us to. I don't care if it costs me my life over it. You can throw me into that furnace. That's fine. I'm not going to worship you. And you see this level of determination out of this. But their words, I think, when he says, but even if he does not, are really important. Because when you really look at all of these times that God has talked to them, even back in Deuteronomy chapter 6, he said, fear the Lord your God, serve him only, and take your oaths in his name. Do not follow other gods, the gods of the people around you, for the Lord your God, who is among you, is a jealous God, and his anger will burn against you, and he will destroy you from the face of the land. Do not put your Lord to the test as you did at Massah. I think there's this idea of not only serving God devotedly, constantly, and only him, but also not just testing God. Because had Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, the three of them left it at, God will save us, watch this, it puts God on the spot to do what we want him to do. We need to be careful that we don't fall into that same trap. God has the ability to do all of that. We don't know his plan well enough to be able to say, I will make God do this. I'm going to make him have to do this. What we do, and that's the same way, what were we taught to pray? Lord, if it's your will. And it's that same theme that has run all the way through from back in Deuteronomy. We see it exemplified in Daniel chapter 3, and throughout time that we see this idea that we don't put God to the test. We know his capability is there. We serve him, and we let him work out the details of how it looks. That's kind of the idea that we see through these three guys. So then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, probably because we don't even need to defend ourselves to you. That line alone was probably enough to set him off. And his attitude toward them changed. Because remember, he kind of gave them a second chance. He gave them another opportunity to save themselves by just obey me, and I won't do this to you. What was the original decree? You'll be immediately thrown in. The second chance was actually, surprisingly, as weird as the story is, was Nebuchadnezzar being nice to them because of, I think, some of that memory of why they were in the position they were in. And so he gives them a little bit of a second chance, and his attitude then changes. He gets so angry with them because now, disobey me once, now you've disobeyed me twice, and it's all different now. His anger has ratcheted up a little bit. His attitude toward them changes. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual. The commander commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie them up. I mean, I think he wanted them tied tight. I don't care how hard you have to tie that rope. You are tying them up. They are not getting out. Stoke that fire 7 times hotter. We are going to burn them to a crisp. There's no surviving on this anger. And so he has Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the fiery furnace, or in the blazing furnace. In verse 21, so these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. I've never been that close to a massive amount of fire that just the proximity of it could kill you, but I can't imagine how hot this really must have been. I've been on one of those backlot studio tours at Universal years ago when they have like those flame explosion things that feel like afterward you check to make sure your eyebrows are still there. It's like, I don't know if it made it. Those are hot enough and that's from here to that far wall away. I can't imagine how hot this really must have been. And for them to have been thrown in there and and there must have been some way from a safe distance away, probably still feeling the searing heat off of it where Nebuchadnezzar is watching this whole thing happens. Then Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men that were tied up and thrown into the fire? And they replied, certainly, Your Majesty. He said, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire. Remember, they were tied up tight. I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed. And the 4th looks like a son of the gods. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace, only so close, because again, he couldn't get too close or he would have died himself. And so that's why I think the shouting was necessary. He's not right up next to it. He approaches it close enough. And from a distance, he's like, I see 4 of them. And he gets closer. And he gets toward the opening of it and then shouts, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. Because remember, they told him, our God will save us. And even if he doesn't, we're still not serving yours. But he has the capability to save us. And he watched it happen right before his eyes. And so on this one, he says, I see a 4th one. Well, who is this 4th one walking around? This has been a source of confusion there. Of all these, there's only one version that really states it slightly differently. But could it be Son of God? Is it an angel, or it's something else that appeared like a son of God, or is it a son of the gods, as he says it? What's thrown a lot of people off is only the King James Version is the only version that actually translated it Son of God and capitalized the S. No other version does. The original text does not look like it would imply that it was Jesus, because first of all, how would Nebuchadnezzar had known? I mean, how would he have looked in them and like, that looks like Jesus? I mean, that would make no sense that Nebuchadnezzar would even know that. He's pagan, first of all. Jesus hadn't even been on the earth yet. And so there's a lot of reasons why that wouldn't really make any sense. Now, if it were Jesus in a pre-Messiah, pre-Christ form, then, I'm not saying it's not possible, but it doesn't make sense that Nebuchadnezzar's words would have been, that looks like the Son of God. And he doesn't even know God. And so he's pagan. And so that wouldn't have made sense. He saw something angelic, something supernatural about this, and he refers to him as a son of the gods. And that's how it's referenced. And I think also when we get to verse 35, or that's 35, when we get to verse 38, it clarifies maybe what Nebuchadnezzar was seeing there. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair on their head singed. The robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. That in and of itself is amazing. I mean, you can't get near a campfire and then hide the fact that you've been near a campfire, right? The fact they don't even have an odor of anything singed or burned or smoke or anything like that on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego." Again, pendulum now swings yet another direction. It goes from, I'm going to set up this god or of some kind, whatever, image. That's this huge statue. And everybody's going to worship it. And then when nobody, or when one person breaks the rule, in this case, 3 person breaks the rule, he loses his ever-loving mind over it. And he throws them into this fire. And then he jumps to his feet and he's like, there's 4 of them in there. And one of them looks like he's angelic. And so then they come over and now he's like, praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel. Again, that's where I think the clarity comes in that verse 28, where he kind of states it in such a way, and I think before I said 38, but it's 28. He states it in a way that clarifies what he thought he saw. And again, these are Nebuchadnezzar's words too. So we have to be really careful that we don't take Nebuchadnezzar's words of what he's describing, what he saw, and assuming that that's going to give us some sort of biblical understanding of exactly how all this happened. I think if God wanted us to know that this was pre-incarnate Jesus had come down into that fiery furnace and saved him, he would have told us something more than what we were told. All he wants us to see is that he intervened. That's all we really need to know out of this. How, who, to some degree, I hate to say it this way, is somewhat irrelevant. What's relevant about this is that God did this. He needed to save Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Don't lose sight of where all this is going. He needs them to be in control so that the Jews continue to hold on to this kind of elevated status that will then carry over into the next empire. But he says that praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. And so now he's able to, after witnessing this miraculous salvation through this blazing fire, he's able to see the power of God. And he goes on and he says, so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, I think I put that in there twice. Read that again. I put these both in twice. Maybe I hit backward. Maybe that's what I did. All right, therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces, and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way. You know, if anything, Nebuchadnezzar's probably glad he was not king over the Persian Empire, because decrees can't be changed under the Medes and the Persians. In Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar can just have whatever his mind is on right then. He's like, he goes from 1 minute, if they serve that God, I'll throw him into a fire. And to the next one is, and if anybody doesn't serve that God, I'll chop them to pieces. And I mean, this guy, I don't know how word got out to the land around him to know what they were supposed to be doing at any time. I mean, really think about it. What kind of confusing life it must have been to be in Babylon. Knowing that there's all these rules and everything, they just heard the day before, you better worship this idol and rat out anybody who doesn't do it, and they'll be thrown into a fire. But you better not now speak about this God in any way, shape, or form. There may have been, for all we know, people who then turned around and said, hey, I saw someone else who wasn't bowing down. Are you saying something bad about that God? Chop them to pieces. And we don't know how this played itself out, but it's so, again, it's so like constant flip back and forth, and it's got to be exhausting to even try to keep up and follow where Nebuchadnezzar's mind's going on this. So then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. And so we see at the end of this here, God's at work again. He makes sure that his people are protected, cared for, that they not only survive it, but they come out better on the other side. He not only foiled this plan by the astrologers, who shouldn't have had any issue with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego after Daniel saved their lives, essentially. God, through Daniel, saved their lives. He ends up earning them a promotion. And so now they're at an even higher position within the province of Babylon. And what he's doing is he's constantly setting things up for this later return of his people by elevating them in their present situation to be ready for when the Medes and the Persians come into power, that he can utilize that strong relationship these leaders of that land have to then issue a decree like, why are you here anyway as enslaved people? Why don't you go back to Jerusalem and rebuild that? And God leads Cyrus in that way to send them back in writing during a time where words can't be undone, when decrees can't be reversed. And so it becomes a lasting proclamation that they have to go back and rebuild it. God didn't want Nebuchadnezzar to send them back because Nebuchadnezzar can change his mind at any minute and all's thrown out the window. He needed them to stay there a little while, appreciate what God's going to do for them, and he waits until later to send them back when the laws can't be changed in those situations. And again, they need these so that when the Medes come in there, God's plan can be completed. Anybody have any comments or thoughts on this? Again, maybe not the way we always study, from the time we were kids, we were all studying the fiery furnace, and we focused all on the fire and all that. But I think there's a bigger thing going on here. It's an example of Nebuchadnezzar's craziness, to be honest. He is just not right. And we're going to see that. It's not weird. He's going to literally lose his mind for years and years, too. But he's not right in the head ever. And part of that is when you're in that position of authority, it corrupts and changes you to a point where he can't seem to fire correctly and all of this. And there's just something not quite right about this guy. But God uses him as his instrument to bring about the reconciliation of his people back to the land where he wants them, in the rebuilding of everything. And things actually, at the end of this whole story, that this is one small little section of, the end of this whole thing is a really good thing that God's going to bring about on there. All right, we'll wind it down there. And for those in the second service, stick around. Otherwise, if you're first service people, have a great week, and we'll see you again next Sunday.